Russia has been forced to bomb its own territory for the first time in the war in Ukraine to repel an invasion by Ukraine-backed partisans, as NATO officials visiting Kyiv for the first time tell allies not to lose heart.
Kyiv again, and this is a scene of yet. We're in Kyiv again.
My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. We're going to start today with news that Russia appears to have launched airstrikes on villages inside its own territory in Belgorod region in an attempt to repel, displace pro-Ukrainian Russian partisans who've seized a number of villages on Russian soil. Now, these are an amalgamation of groups including Freedom of Russia Legion, the Russia Volunteer Corps, and the Siberian Battalion. These are ostensibly Russian nationals who've been exiled in Ukraine, armed and trained, we understand, in Ukraine, who have launched attacks on Russian soil in a bid, in their own words, to topple the regime. These are anti-Putin forces. In our previous update, we talked about these partisans taking the village of Tetkino in Russia's Kursk Oblast. More recently, in the last few days, they've launched attacks into Belgorod, taking a village called Kozinka and Gorkovsky. And it's in Kozinka, we understand, that Russia has dropped a number of Fab 500 glide bombs. These are modified bombs which have wings on them to make them more accurate. 500 kilograms of explosives in the Fab 500. Devastating weapons footage emerging from those strikes, showing the power of those blasts. But the very fact that Russia has had to use these weapons on its own territory is, in a sense, a sort of victory for Ukraine, because what these partisan attacks appear to be doing is distracting Russia, stretching its forces, forcing Moscow and the Kremlin to divert resources to Russia's, or to rather to Ukraine's northern border, when perhaps Russia would prefer to have those forces battling away in the east, where it's been waging such a bloody war of attrition. The second thing we're going to talk about today is the visit by Admiral Rob Bows to Kyiv. Admiral Bows is the chair of NATO's military committee, and his visit to Kyiv is symbolic. It's the first time an official NATO delegation has visited the capital since Russia launched its full-scale invasion over 2 years ago. Now, one of his key messages was that the world must not be too overly pessimistic about Ukraine's prospects in this fight. He said pessimists don't win wars. He made the point that perhaps Ukraine's allies had made the mistake of being overly optimistic last year, and that was really optimism around what Ukraine may have achieved during its long-awaited, much vaunted summer counteroffensive, which mostly took place in south-central Zaporizhia province. But you'll remember Ukraine was unable to significantly breach those incredibly heavy Russian defences known as the Surovikin line. Admiral Bows said that NATO is doing everything to get ready for Ukraine to join the military alliance. That clearly is something that Ukraine has campaigned on for a long time, but Ukraine cannot join NATO whilst it is a country at war. And actually, at the previous NATO summit, President Zelensky was disappointed that NATO hadn't taken the steps. There wasn't the political will he was hoping for to accelerate NATO joining. But nonetheless, Bows in Kyiv today making that message that he believes Ukraine can and will win, that there are reasons for Ukraine to be confident, but nonetheless not ignoring the fact that what Ukraine needs is help from its allies. And he echoed the words of NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who said that allies need to dig deep and deliver promptly. But one of those reasons for confidence is perhaps the topic I want to talk about third today, and that is the continuing success of Ukrainian strikes deep behind the front line, hundreds of miles inside Russian territory. Now, the most recent one appears to be at least 4 drones hitting the Engels 2 airbase in Saratov. Now, this is home to some of Russia's most powerful long-range strategic bombers, the Tupolev 160, the Tupolev 95. These are planes known respectively as the Blackjack and the Bear in their NATO reporting names. These are nuclear-capable strategic bomber aircraft. Now, it's not clear how much damage those 4 drone strikes by Ukraine may have caused, but again, a demonstration of Ukraine's capability. The fact is that despite everything else that is happening on the battlefield, Ukraine continues to hit deep behind Russian lines. It's developed this capability itself. We understand a lot of this is Ukrainian technology, Ukrainian ingenuity and innovation. And this latest strike against the airbase comes after a week, 10 days of strikes against Russian oil refineries. Now, the estimates vary, but I've read on Bloomberg, the Financial Times and Reuters that between 7 and 12% of Russia's oil refining capacity has been hit by these strikes. And as a result of that, the oil price, the global oil price, was nudged up earlier this week to a 4-month high. Ukrainian officials have said that what they are doing, hitting these refineries, is a deliberate attempt to starve Russia of the income that it gets from exporting oil, and also to limit the resources that it has, that the military has at its disposal. So both by limiting its own availability of oil and limiting the amount of income that it can get from it. Now, important to have a quick look at just what's happening on the battlefield. Not an awful lot of changes in terms of territory. It continues to be this relentless war of attrition. We have seen Russia making gains in Avdiivka, most significantly, most recently, but there continues to be fierce fighting around there. Concerning update recently from the Institute for the Study of War, which tracks the conflict very closely, warning that Russia appears to be gearing up for a full-blown conflict with NATO. This is something that perhaps NATO and the West was aware of, but the Institute for the Study of War saying this appears to be happening more quickly than perhaps Western policy makers were expecting. It's a combination of President Vladimir Putin, who's recently sort of been anointed after his sham election victory, trying to focus on the resilience of the economy, and announcements from Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, about how Russia is reshaping its armed forces. He says adding 2 new divisions on top of the 12 that were announced last year, and also in creating a flotilla of a sort of maritime force, a riverine force, which he called the Dnipro Flotilla. An important reminder that much as Russia is locked in this conflict, it is also trying to prepare for the long-term element at both sides, aware that this is a war of attrition, it is a war of resources, and staying power will be absolutely crucial in terms of who emerges victorious. Now, thank you as ever for your questions. If you're watching on YouTube, please do ask your questions in the comments below, and we will endeavour to answer them next time. A lot of the questions on last week's episode were around the Pope Francis, and of course his slightly extraordinary comments suggesting that Ukraine needed to have the courage to show the white flag, effectively calling on Ukraine to surrender, which caused huge disquiet and upset inside Ukraine, and in fact was also criticised in Russia. The Ukrainians saying, "How dare you tell us to surrender?" The Russians saying, "We don't want peace. We don't want negotiations. We're going to destroy Ukraine and fight on." Now, a lot of the questions really asking, why did the Pope say this? What was he thinking? The Pope had, in his early statements around the war, been quite critical of Russia's invasion. Ultimately, the motivation, it seems that the motivation of the Pope was humanitarian, to try and end any more bloodshed in the swiftest way possible. That is the best explanation that I can fathom. And nonetheless, I mean, the Ukrainian argument would be that to capitulate would merely pave the way for more bloodshed in future, both in terms of what Russia might do if and when they controlled Ukrainian territory uncontested, and indeed how an emboldened Russia might then continue the march of aggression into other countries in Europe. One of the questions was, please could we have some clarity on the number of casualties there have been on both sides? It's a really good question, and the truth is we can't have that much clarity because the number of dead and wounded on both sides is a pretty closely guarded secret. So the best we have are the estimates that are provided from various sources, from independent analysts and from governments, and indeed very occasionally from the countries involved in the fighting. So on the Russian side, there was a survey published last week in the Kiev Independent, or rather an investigation, which claimed that Russian investigative journalists had identified some 47,700 Russian personnel who'd been killed in the conflict. Now, I can't vouch for the authenticity of that, although the people behind the investigation said they believed the figure would be much higher. So that's nearly 50,000 dead, according to that investigation, in Russia. That does appear to chime with the Western estimates that 350,000 Russians have been killed and wounded over the last 2 and a bit years in Ukraine. And that's because what we've heard repeatedly from Western defense intelligence analysts is that Russia's killed to wounded ratio is about 1 to 4. So for every 4 soldiers wounded, there is 1 killed. Now, that's much higher, we were told, than the killed to wounded ratio in the Ukrainian. So for every 1 to 10, for every 1 Ukrainian soldier who's been killed, there might be 10 who've been wounded but survive. And that's for a number of reasons, but partly down to better medical provision on the Ukrainian side. President Zelensky said in his anniversary press conference that Ukraine had lost 31,000 soldiers. Many would expect President Zelensky to provide perhaps an underestimate in that circumstance, but nonetheless, if you were to take a 10-to-1 ratio, then Ukraine might be looking at perhaps 300,000 wounded, and then in broad ballpark figures, both sides have lost many hundreds of thousands. The only significant difference perhaps is that Russia has lost far more killed. But as I said at the beginning, precision, clarity on those numbers is very, very difficult. I think it's only safe to say that huge numbers of people have been killed, huge numbers of people have been wounded, and that is the price of this conflict. Indeed, that's a message that came through from Rob Bows in his visit to Kyiv, is that time in Ukraine is being measured in lives. Final question today was, why is Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz afraid of giving Kyiv its Taurus missiles? Now, these are German cruise missiles similar to the British Storm Shadows, similar to the French Scalps, which London and Paris have already provided, but the Taurus have a much longer range, and that's why Ukraine wants them to strike more targets deeper and further behind the Russian lines. The simple answer is that Germany is concerned about escalation. It's concerned that if it provides these weapons, they might either be used to attack Russian soil, they might be seen as that Germany is stepping up its support for Ukraine in a way that could trigger an even bigger response from Russia. And I think there is also an element of domestic politics. Scholz doesn't want to be the warmonger. He doesn't want to be seen to be leading Germany further into this conflict, rather, trying to support Ukraine, but also trying to sort of manage it perhaps towards a more peaceful outcome rather than escalating it. And the final question I will actually answer today is, a lot of you were asking about a man over my right shoulder in the left half of your screen who appears to be holding up a television. That is in fact a cardboard cutout of the boxer Tyson Fury. It's a trick of the camera. He's not actually touching the television, but there you go. There isn't a real person holding up a television over my shoulder. But thank you for paying attention. Thank you for being so observant. Again, if you do have any questions about Ukraine, or about the presentation, then please make them in the comments below, and we'll endeavour to answer them again next week. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe to The Sun. If you're listening as a podcast, then please don't forget to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.